Hi folks, and welcome to Chapter 12, Soil and Agriculture. All right, so we have been dealing with soil and agriculture for a long time, and there's actually a lot of controversial issues, like all of these ecological issues, surrounding the growth of our food. So we're going to be talking about in this unit things like genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. So in 2001, genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, were found in native maize, which means that the genes from these genetically modified plants were kind of skipping over into other plants during the process of fertilization when the pollen flew. They didn't really anticipate this as being a problem, but it turned out to be one. So activists are really worried about the fact that these GMOs can contaminate other food sources, basically making all the plants genetically modified without intentionally doing it. And this could reduce the diversity of our natural food supply, which would be bad because diversity is a huge strength in nature. So the GM industry is defending this, and they think that they are necessary for feeding the growing population because you can grow more food per plant. And as our population continues to grow, this is a real problem, that without these genetically modified foods, we would not be able to feed our growing populations. So we're going to be looking into how we handle our soil, how we handle agriculture, and in the end, what do we think about these GMOs? Because there's always two sides to the coin. So let's go into our soil. So about 38% of our Earth's land surface is used for agriculture to grow crops of some kind or another, which sounds like a lot, but then all the rest is used for other things, and you have to be able to be really efficient in how you are farming to feed this huge growing population of humans. So what exactly is soil? Soil is made out of minerals that come from rocks, essentially, the bedrock being broken down over time. Organic matter, which comes from decomposed living organisms, plants and animals. Pockets of air and water. So that's what soil is made out of. It is mostly made out of decomposed bedrock, but there is this organic component that's in the topsoil. So of course, what your soil is made out of is very much influenced by the climate, how dry it is, how wet it is, what kind of bedrock is there, that's the parent material, what organisms are present, so like worms are really great at making good fertile soil, hence the snail-eating worm down there, and of course time and the landforms that are surrounding them all will influence the composition of your soil and how fertile it is. So here's a little graphic just showing us the composition. So 45 to 48% is mineral matter, the broken down rock, all right, just broken down rock. Only 2 to 5% is organic, which is very little, which is why when you're talking about biotic or abiotic, remember biotic is living or previously lived, and abiotic is never lived, they consider soil abiotic because even though there is this organic component to it, it is very, very small compared to everything else. So it's basically made out of non-living stuff, which is the minerals, the air, and the water. So if you have fertile soil, it can support the growth of healthy plants, which is what we need, right, to grow food. And when you have good fertile soil is when you dig in the soil and you find a lot of earthworms. That's what they really like, and they're going to create that fertile soil for you as they break down the organic material. And they also aerate the soil, which is very important to the health of your soil as well. All right, so soil forms when our bedrock is broken down in smaller fragments, either by wind, water, or chemical weathering over time. So weathering, in case you forgot, is the physical and chemical breaking up of rocks and minerals into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. Erosion is a little bit different. Erosion and deposition is when you're picking up these pieces of soil or rock and transporting them somewhere, and then you're going to deposit them, hence deposition, you're going to deposit them. So they drop off that material into another place. So they're leaving the place that it's found at. They're taking something away. Decomposition we're going to be talking about a lot because that's the breakdown of waste or organisms putting those nutrients back into the soil, which is necessary to maintain fertile soil. So the little mushroom over here, mushrooms are decomposers, and the bulk of this fungi is under the ground, and this is actually just their reproductive organ, the mushroom that you see above. It's called a fruiting body. And all the fungus that's under the ground is going to take these nice leaves and all this organic material that's down in there and break it up and put some of those nutrients back in the ground. Same thing earthworms do, and bacteria, they all do those same kind of activities as decomposers. All right, so here's an example of weathering. So you can see where this rock has been broken down into smaller pieces over time, and it created like these sands that are right over here. Here is another example of weathering from water. So this is from sea spray, where it's breaking up this rock a little bit over time. And this can also be erosion, where it's eroding the rock and it's going to take that parent material away. This is definitely erosion and deposition. So you can see where the water has flowed through these cracks, creating the cracks, and taken the soil with it. So it's no longer there. And so that's a very obvious example that it's going to be deposited somewhere else. All right, this is also erosion that we see on the cliffs, where the water will hit the cliffs and then it will take all that material away with it and deposit somewhere else, actually usually just causing water pollution. And so here's the deposition you would see at the end of the waterway. This is all soil that has been pushed down, and this would not happen if we had more vegetation. All right, vegetation helps to prevent erosion. And this is decomposition. All right, so the bacteria, the little microbes, any insects that are decomposers, worms, are going to break down these dead organisms into their basic organic compounds. All right, and that's why you see the color changing over here, and that's all going to land up back into the soil and part of a component of the topsoil. So when we're talking about soil, we have these different what's called horizons. All right, different horizons are different levels of the soil. So if we start at the very top, some graphics use the O horizon and some do not. The O stands for organic. So organic is like your living organisms here that are carbon-based life forms. So organic is like the very top, where you're going to have your dead leaves and branches, any dead animals that are up here. That's your organic. As that gets broken down by the decomposers, you go into the A horizon. So that's the first one, like first letter of the alphabet. And this is your topsoil. So this is most fertile soil is on the top. This is what they sell when you go to Lowe's to buy soil for your yard or something, is they sell bags of topsoil because it's fertile. All right, down from there is the E horizon. This is the leaching layer. So this is where water is going to go down in here. It tends to be a little more rocky. So if you dig through your topsoil, this is where you start hitting rocks and it starts getting harder to dig. All right, down below there you got your subsoil. And then here you get to your parent material, but this parent material has like little cracks in it. It's starting to be weathered. And then your solid parent material. So here this is sometimes impermeable at this level. So the details of our layers, there's A horizon, which I said earlier was your surface soil or topsoil. It has all the organic material because the organic layer above it decomposes into it. Like I said earlier, most fertile. You got the highest concentration of plant roots in here because they're going to absorb that water as it's going down, along with the nutrients that it will carry with it. And you have a lot of living organisms in this area, especially decomposers. So you'll find earthworms, ants, bacteria, and your fungi growing in this layer. B horizon tends to be a little finer in texture. Sometimes you can see the difference in coloration. So here's your topsoil here. This is your B layer right there that's darker in color. So you have less organic matter, which is also why you see a difference in color sometimes. And ours, you see a little more clay in this layer. The colors are often brighter, shades of red because that red clay, brown because it's compacted more, or even yellow depending on the type of soil that you're in. C horizon is partially weathered parent material. Okay, so here it is right down here. So there's your A horizon. You can see all the roots in there, this dark soil. B horizon, the little brighter soil has a little more clay component to it in some places. And then you hit your rocks, all right, in your C horizon. And you can see those rocks more clearly here in this picture. This is where it gets hard to dig. And then you can see the other layers of the soil up there. So a lot of rocks in that layer. All right, then you have the R horizon, or the parent or bedrock. So this is a more solid rock. So if you're driving down the road and you see the side of the mountain like this, because they've blasted it to make room for the road, that's your parent material, all right, that's going to make these soils up above it. So soils have different characteristics. There's 12 major soil groups. The groups are then classified according to the properties like the color of them, the structure, the pH, and the texture. So texture is based on particle size. So texture is the #1 thing that's easiest to just observe, basically. You have to measure pH. You can observe color, of course, but that can be trickier. But texture is a little easier. So the main ones you have is clay, silt, and sand, and all these other ones are a combination of those. So you got clay loam, you got sandy clay, you got silty clay, so there's some kind of combination of these. So what exactly do these mean? Well, sand tends to be range in size from very fine to very coarse, so you get a variety of particle size there. You can see the particles without a magnifying glass, so they're relatively large compared to some of the other ones. And they feel coarse and gritty, so think sandpaper. Versus silt, which you're probably less familiar with, these are significantly smaller than the sand, but not the smallest. You can still sometimes see the individual pieces without a microscope. If it's wet, it feels very smooth when you rub it between your hands, but not sticky like clay would be. And when it's dry, it turns into dust very, very easily. Versus clay, clay has the most fine particles. You cannot see the individual particles without a microscope. It's very, very smooth, or when it's dry, it is powdery as well, but it's sticky when it's wet, and that's something that separates it out from silt. And that's why we can make pots out of it. All right, guys, so that is 12.1. I'm going to continue on for 12.2, so you can pause or go ahead and pull up that note sheet if you want, and we can continue on with the notes. So some estimates predict that 50 million people could be displaced in the next 10 years due to desertification, the process of turning your land into deserts. And it's a form of soil degradation, so your soil is no longer fertile. So this is a picture from the Great Dust Storm that happened in Texas in 1935 that contributed to the Depression times. So of course erosion plays a huge part in the health of our land. So remember, erosion is when you're breaking down that soil and moving it one place to another. So if we're talking about farming practices, we're worried about the topsoil because that's where most of the nutrients is. And if the land is dry, the wind itself can just pick up this topsoil in the form of dust, take it away and deposit it somewhere else. So erosion can be caused by natural processes like the wind, but it can also be influenced by human activities and how we treat the land. Like having all flat land like this is actually really, really bad because it makes it super easy to lose topsoil. All right, you should have larger plants in here to protect that topsoil from the wind. So soil can obviously be eroded faster than it can be formed. It takes a lot of time to form good soil. And that depletes your fertility of your land. It makes it harder to grow crops. And then your farms go debunked, okay? So what could we do differently that would prevent some of this erosion and problems with losing our topsoil and even possibly contribute to using water more efficiently? Well, one of the practices is intercropping. Now, intercropping on small farms works really, really super well. Our large factory farms are very resistant to this because it takes a lot more manual labor to harvest your crop, whereas they use these huge machinery to harvest crop quickly and efficiently. So it kind of depends on the kind of farm you are as to whether this would work. But it does indeed work and is far superior than factory farming as far as the health of your soil, which we must maintain in order to continue growing food indefinitely. So intercropping, like the name you have different crops interdispersed. So you mix these crops together. So down here you can see you have maize, which is kind of corn, soybeans, and oats, and they're planted instead of uniformly as a monoculture, they are planted interdispersed with one another. And this does a lot of things for the farm and for the soil and basically for humans. One of the things it does is it reduces the needs for pesticides, which are bad for all of us. We know it's bad. And fertilizers. When you have a field that's all one crop and you have an insect that preys on that crop and they find it, they're going to infest the entire crop. Whereas when they're spaced apart, the insects might have a slightly harder time finding the crops. They have to work a little bit harder. And so that maintains your crops much, much better. This has been scientifically studied. We know it to be true, that if you mix different plants, and you can even put ground cover in that naturally repels insects, and plants naturally do that, like marigolds. And so those will help to reduce your need for pesticide, which is better for everyone, better for the environment, better for humanity, because pesticides are nasty, nasty chemicals. Also fertilizers, so things like beans or legumes, they put nutrients back in the soil. There's something that makes nitrogen. So if you have a good nitrogen fixing plant like legumes, and you plant them in this strip this year and they're going to make actually that soil better quality, the next year you can switch and you can keep your land super rich in nitrogen without buying fertilizers, which money-wise is better for the farmer. And fertilizers, of course, get into our runoff and pollute our waterways. So just by changing our farming practices, we can reduce the dependence on these things. Also, another thing it does is it reduces weeds, because weeds are just another kind of parasite, essentially. It's a plant parasite. So again, if you have different kinds of plants, the weeds have to deal with them differently, and it reduces their growth. All right, so all these things are great things that come with intercropping, but as you can tell, you can't use one kind of machinery to go through and harvest all these different kind of crops. And so it is more labor intensive, and that's where the farmer then has to pay more, especially if you're a large farm. If you're a small farm, it's not that big a deal. You can grow food this way. And as a matter of fact, our people in the past used to. So along with intercropping, you could do crop rotation, which is what I mentioned with the soybeans. Crop rotation is planting your different crops in different years so that you use some of the crops that are really good, like the legumes or clover or alfalfa, that are really good at putting nitrogen in the ground, and that helps to keep your soil fertile, which is the goal. We got to have fertile soil to grow food. It also keeps the pathogens down, just like intercropping. So these kind of work together, and you can do crop rotation without intercropping. All you have to do is make a plan, and so that's what this is down here in the corner that's changing colors. The farmers make a plan over which fields, and these are monocultures that they have here in this plan, but which fields are they going to plant which crop in which year. And by rotating them and not always planting the same thing in the same place, it makes the parasites have a harder time finding that food source every year. They have to search for it, which means less insects, less pesticides needed. It also keeps your soil more healthy because you can rotate the legumes or the alfalfas to put the nitrogen back in the soil. And these are all crops that the farmers can sell, all right? They're just doing a variety of crops instead of specializing in just one. And you make a plan to rotate them through, which is really smart to do. Then we got these things called shelter belts. So a lot of farmers have bought into the idea of shelter belts. This is something that's really caught on. And if you drive down the highway near where there's a lot of farms, sometimes you can see them from your car on the different farms. And all this is around your different fields, you plant trees. And you plant trees so that the wind, when it comes across the fields, the trees are blocking some of the wind. So smart, right? You give up these very small strips of land in order to maintain your topsoil and not have it leave through erosion. And so this one is kind of cute because it looks like a tic-tac-toe board. But that's all you do. And this, by the way, is also better for wildlife because they have somewhere to go besides the open field and maintain some of our wildlife as well. So better environmentally, better for farming, better all around. All right, then we got conservation tillage. This is something that is picking up some ground with farmers. More and more of them are buying into this type of farming, especially small scale farms. Again, they're always quicker to pick up on the new technologies than large scale because large scale farms are very kind of caught up into the equipment they own to do the farming. And the equipment is so expensive and they go in so much debt to get it that they have to use it essentially. So conservation tillage is basically when you have your crops from the year before die, you do not just remove them, all right? So you don't till the soil. Instead, you leave them there and let them start to rot, and then when it's time to replant, you replant right over the top of them. And so this does a couple things. By not tilling the soil, when you till the soil, you flip this upside down, you're keeping all this organic material, which is fine, but you're exposing now soil that was underneath that is no longer held in place by roots. And so by tilling the soil, you're actually causing a lot of erosion and runoff and losing more topsoil. So this helps by you're keeping your carbon here. All this carbon in the leftover parts of the plants from the year before is going to decompose and go back down into the soil, which is good for the new baby plants growing. And you're preventing erosion because these roots will hold that soil in place until you have new root systems from the new plants. And so by doing that and just keeping that there, you're keeping your soil, you're creating more soil, which keeps it healthier. Then we got terracing. Terracing is really beautiful to look at, like aesthetically gorgeous, as you can see. It's a lot of work to set up. But they use terracing a lot in South America for sure. It is very labor intensive, which is why factory farms do not like this. But they do it a lot in South America because they have the Andes Mountains and stuff there, and they can farm on the side of the mountains essentially and use that land. So it can maximize your arable land area, places that you didn't think you could farm in because they weren't flat. You can farm in using terracing. And this does a couple things. Terracing reduces soil erosion. So when it rains, because you have the water, it comes down and it hits the next terrace and some of it gets absorbed, hits the next terrace, gets absorbed. So instead of having just a straight down like a slide on the side of your mountain where your farm is, having these little terraces makes the water pause. Some of it soaks in on its way down, which means less irrigation for the farmers, right? Less runoff that's going to take your topsoil with it, and less erosion. But the bad part of terracing is, like I said, is labor intensive, that you have to typically do your harvest your crops by hand, which they do in most of the cases in South America anyways. They don't have as many large factory farms. So this works really well, and if you ever go to South America like Ecuador, you can see a lot of these really beautiful terraced farms on the sides of the mountains. Contour farming is very similar to terracing, except instead of having that stair-step type thing, you just plant your crops in these like the contours of the land, hence the name. So they look at the slope of the hill and they do it perpendicular to that, so that when rainwater comes down, it's hitting these different stripes of vegetation. And what that will do, is you could probably figure out, is it will trap some of the water. So it conserves rainwater, which means less irrigation needed. We preserve more of our aquifer, which is a wonderful idea. Reduces erosion because that's going to trap some of the soil in these different contours. And so the good part about it is this is a little easier too to harvest. And they can use these little tracks across the slopes that act like reservoirs to catch the rain, and then use those tracks to drive your larger machinery still around the contours to harvest. So a little bit easier to harvest than terracing, but does a lot of the same things. But you have to be very purposeful in planning out your farm if you're going to do contour farming. You have to think about the lay of the land very logically. So we also have to look at ranching a little bit when we're talking about farming. Ranching is not growing plants. This is raising and grazing of livestock. So think like cows, sheep, things like that, goats. When it comes to ranching, the problem we have environmentally is overgrazing. When you put your livestock in one area and they stay in that one area and you're not moving them around, which is what happens in factory farms, that they have overgrazing, which kills the plants, and the plants don't grow back. And so on factory farms that are raising cows and livestock, these guys are not on grass, and because they're not on grass, they're not eating grass, and these animals evolved to eat grass. So instead, they're feeding them grain, which means they need to pay for the grain instead of the grass that would be otherwise free. And grain is not their natural diet, and actually causes them to overgrow microbes in their guts, which can lead to things like mad cow disease, which then when we slaughter them, humans can get. So everybody knows scientifically that factory farming of livestock is not the healthy way to do this, and yet we can't seem to break that cycle. We need to go back to, at least for livestock, small independent farms that their animals can actually graze and eat the appropriate food for their digestive tract. The resistance to that is cost, right? Everybody wants their meat as cheap as possible. So range managers, part of what they need to be doing is encourage grazing limits so that they don't overgraze, and enforce them on publicly owned land so that if they move their cattle around, which you would have to do proper grazing, that you're not letting them overuse that space so that the resources are still there. And that kind of harkens back to something we learned at the beginning of the year with tragedy of the commons and how we share our common spaces. So this is what ranching should look like in a healthy ecosystem. And this is back to, days of cowboys, which they still do in some spots, where they move the livestock through these pastures and out into these common grazing areas where they're eating their native food, which is good for their gut microbes, and they're being raised in a healthy way, and that makes the cows healthier, which means we produce food that is healthier for humans. This is what our factory farms look like. So this is like how McDonald's makes its beef, and it makes it so cheap so that they can sell a McDonald's burger for $1 or $2, and the animals live this way. And this is obviously not a healthy situation for the animal, and when the animals are ill and then we make food out of them, that then is transferred to us. So when we were talking about forestry, one of the things we talked about is how bad clear cutting was, and that it caused a lot of erosion, and I used this picture right here, same slide. And so we know that this is really bad when we cut all the plants down. We do this for farming a lot. And so what we can land up with is this thing called desertification, and I don't mean dessert like chocolate cake, I mean desert, okay? So when you lose more than 10% of your soil's productivity, the plants don't grow as well, and then you can land up with a desert. So causes of this is soil compaction. So soil is supposed to be aerated. You have to have these little bubbles, and usually our earthworms do that for us. If you need to till the soil, you can do it. There's things that you can poke holes in your soil that causes aeration of your soil. So even growing your lawn, there's things that you can use to make your lawn grow better, and one of them is a little pokey thing that you roll across your lawn to aerate it. So if your soil gets too compact, it gets too hard, plants have a hard time growing in it, worms have a hard time living in it, and then your soil is just going to degrade over time. Of course, erosion, overgrazing that we already looked at, droughts for sure, because that will compact your soil as well. You're supposed to have a component of water in there. And there's lots of other factors that can contribute to this. Now, when we see this desertification, usually we see in arid and semi-arid places like the Middle East that are the most prone, which is why they have problems growing food. Like when some of us watched the video together on the Age of Consequences, we saw that that was a common theme in the Middle East, is that they had these droughts that led to food insecurity and water insecurity, which then led people to act out with violence. All right, so this can affect large amounts of our land, and up to 1/3 is one estimate, which is really kind of scary because we already have limited arable land. And the Dust Bowl was something that occurred because of desertification. So where our concern is where the Ogallala Aquifer is, because we're pulling water out of that aquifer so quickly that we're going to use that resources faster than it can recharge if we don't change our practices. And then all these farms where we grow the bulk of our food in the United States will not have a good, reliable water source. And then we can have some very, very serious food insecurities here in the United States. So we do have some things to kind of help how we manage our soil. In the United States, we have the Soil Conservation Act of 1935 that happened around the Dust Bowl because they're like realizing that their practices might not have been the best practices at that point. And they established the Soil Conservation Service where they do research in how to conserve our soil, keep it fertile, best practices to use, some of which we learned about in this lecture. And today they call it the Natural Resources Conservation Service, so they wrap some other things up in with it. Then we also have the Farmer-Centered Agricultural Resource Management Program, or FARM, which is an appropriate name for that. This is a whole United Nations effort, so a worldwide effort that focuses on challenges in farming in developing nations so that people in those nations can feed their population. And there are significant challenges there. And the reason why countries buy into these programs like this and actually donate money to them, which a lot of people get all salty about the fact that the United States puts money into these programs, but it benefits us in the long run because it keeps these places stable, which means we don't need to intervene if war breaks out in these places. So if people can feed themselves and feed their families, they're less likely to have conflict. All right, so another thing we need to be worried about is soil pollution. So using these best farming practices, especially on our small farms, or supporting small farms over factory farms more often, you can actually help keep the soil less polluted, which also keeps our water less polluted and helps keep humans healthy. So irrigation can be a problem. We talked about irrigation already a lot with water. And if you don't do irrigation correctly, not only are you wasting water, which is a precious resource, but you also can cause erosion and waterlogged crops. And you can have something called salinization, where you have too much salt, a buildup of salt in soils, which would kill your crops. So there's a lot of things that can happen that you need to be very careful about how you manage your plants. And farmers are scientists. They know what they're doing in order to grow their crop. We also want to reduce the reliance on pesticides. When pesticides first came out, people were very, very excited about them because they made it so they could produce more crops that were better looking, which people do are like, oh, I want my apples to look perfect. They don't really need to look perfect, okay? They just don't. They still taste the same if they have a slight little bruise on one side somewhere. All right, you can still eat them. But we have this mindset that we want them to be perfect and unblemished. And the problem is, to do that, we have to remove pests, which are part of the ecosystem. And to do that, we're using these chemicals. The problem is the chemicals are bad for us too. So then when you spray your fruits and veggies with these things, the soil is soaking that up. The plants are covered in it, which is why you have to wash all your fruits and veggies before you eat them. And over time, then it lands up in our water that we're drinking, which is really dumb because we're just poisoning ourselves in the process. So hopefully you learned some good things about best farming practices and can make good choices about where and from whom you get your food. All right, guys, that's it for now.